everyone. Welcome back. I'm your host Nupur, and today I'm back with another interesting interview with Aino Corry. She has authored a book called Retrospectives Antipatterns, and we would like to know about retrospectives, antipatterns, and beyond from her in this discussion. Hi, Aino. How are you?
Hi, Nupur. I'm great. Thank you for inviting me.
Aino, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can. So I'm 51 years old. I live in Denmark with my three kids, my husband, and my cat. And I recently, I mean, it's not that recent anymore. For a few years ago, I wrote this book, Retrospectives Antipatterns, which is about all the mistakes I made facilitating retrospectives. And it all started many years ago. I did a PhD in computer science, which was focused on design patterns in architecture and object-oriented programming. And then I finished that. I came out in industry. I went to a conference. I saw Linda Rising give a talk about project retrospectives. She talked about this book by Norm Kurth. And I got this book and I read it and I thought it was amazing. And I started doing small retrospectives. And then this book by Diana Larsen and Esther Derby came out, Agile Retrospectives, where they're taking all the activities from Norm Kurth's book and they're shrinking them so that you can do them in 20 to 30 minutes. And I just basically started facilitating retrospectives with everybody. I was fortunate enough to have a class by Diana Larsen to learn about how to facilitate retrospectives, and later I got to teach that class together with her. So this book, Retrospectives Antipatterns, is based on my 15 years of experience with facilitating retrospectives. So that's a little bit about me.
That's amazing to know. I know. Thank you very much for sharing with us. So now moving on to explore more about retrospectives, anti-patterns. And we know that retrospectives are indispensable for continuous learning and improvement. Can you please share your views on what a retrospective is?
So to me, a retrospective is a chance for a team to reflect and learn, to figure out how are things going right now, to share experiences, to appreciate each other, to appreciate the struggles that others had, to appreciate others for doing good things, and to learn from that. And I think that that time to reflect is really, really important for a team. I think it's also important for a singular person or a family, but for teams that works with software development, I think it's very important not to skip this meeting, because there'll be some people who are naturally good at reflecting and thinking about where are we right now, wondering about what they're doing. But for some people, it doesn't come natural to reflect, and they need some time set aside to think about this. So to me, it's the core of the inspect and adapt in agile development.
Right, and now coming back to what retrospective anti-patterns are, a lot of people are very curious to know what it is, and if you can mention a few examples, that would be great.
Yeah. So retrospective anti-patterns. I chose to write about anti-patterns because to me, anti-patterns are so valuable. What you see in a pattern is that it's an abstract solution to a common problem, but an anti-pattern, it's an abstract bad solution to a common problem. So, for instance, the prime directive ignorance, which is one of the anti-patterns in the book, the prime directive ignorance is when you facilitate a retrospective, and instead of talking about the prime directive that Norm Kurth wrote about, you choose to ignore it for different reasons, and then you get some bad consequences. So the prime directive ignorance is an explanation or a description of the situation or the anti-pattern you can come in if you ignore the prime directive. So the prime directive, as I said, is about having the mindset that people did the best they could at all times. And if you have that mindset when you enter a retrospective, you're much more open to listening to other people's problems. Plus, you might also be much more willing yourself to share problems you had, or things you were a bit embarrassed about that you couldn't find out how to do, or things that you got stuck with. But if people ignore that because they think it's too much of a hippie thing, or they think it's too embarrassing to really truly believe that everybody did the best, then they might enter the retrospective hoping to find a scapegoat, hoping to find somebody to blame so that it's not embarrassing for them. And if that's the way you enter a retrospective, nothing good will come out of it, because people won't share the really interesting bits. And some people might even become very unhappy with the retrospective. So that's one anti-pattern. Another anti-pattern that I will describe is called Wheel of Fortune. And Wheel of Fortune, you should imagine that you're spinning a Wheel of Fortune in a Tivoli, and you know that little clicker says tick, 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 tick. And then sometimes you end on a prize, you get a prize, but often you end on something where you don't get a prize, you just lost your money. And I call that anti-pattern the Wheel of Fortune, because sometimes when you have a retrospective and you want to rush it, you want to do it as quickly as possible so that you can go back to programming or whatever you're doing, then you sometimes say, let's just do start, stop, continue, and then collect the data there, and then all the start things will start doing that, and the stop things will stop doing that. For instance, maybe they say we should start doing pair programming, and then if you just rush that retrospective, you just say, okay, well, the action point is we'll plan to do pair programming 3 days a week, 3 hours every day. But then, unfortunately, the problem is not that you forget to do the pair programming. It could be that the problem is that you don't have psychological safety enough to do pair programming, to have people looking at what you're doing. So if you rush it, if you don't spend time on generating insights, trying to understand why we have the problems we have, then you might just solve the symptoms and not the actual causes, not the actual problems. So that's why I call it a Wheel of Fortune, because sometimes it's correct that, for instance, if it says let's stop doing peer review, and maybe it's a good thing for this particular team to stop doing peer review. I won't be the judge of that. I don't think it could be, but sometimes it is, and then they solve the problem. But sometimes they only solve the symptom, and then the problem is still there underneath, and it will pop up again in a different way. So the Wheel of Fortune and the prime directive ignorance. And when you know these anti-patterns, then you can communicate with other facilitators. You can say, oh, be careful you're not in prime directive ignorance, or I was in a Wheel of Fortune here. And also for you as a facilitator, that you have some names, some things to remind you to avoid these anti-patterns. So it's about awareness of things that can go wrong.
Absolutely. Thanks for an amazing answer. We should know what could go wrong or what is going wrong, especially when we are doing retrospectives.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's quite challenging, I know, and I would like to know about the biggest challenge for retrospectives, especially when we talk about people and distributed teams. Please share your experience.
Yeah, so I started facilitating distributed retrospectives before COVID. And so I've done that for a few years now. And of course, during COVID, I did a lot of distributed retrospectives. And I think that the biggest problem is that as a facilitator, your responsibility is to make sure that you go through the phases of a retrospective, that everybody is heard, that you are gathering the right data, that you are generating insights, you are understanding it, and you're deciding what to do together as a team. But it's also your responsibility to look at the body language of people and see whether people are disengaged, whether you should change the activity, to see whether they're worried. Maybe you should divide people so they don't discuss these things in plenum, or if some people are talking a lot and some people are talking very little, it's very easy in real life to change the setting. But in a distributed retrospective where people are just online, it's much more difficult to send them out in smaller groups. You can use breakout rooms, but with breakout rooms, you don't know what's happening. You can't walk around and silently listen in on them and see if they're doing all right, if they're discussing the right things, if the discussions are going as they should. But also, you don't have very much of body language to work with when you only see the face of people. And sometimes when people don't even show the video, it's very, very difficult for you as a facilitator to figure out, should we move on? Is this discussion only between two people? Are the others disengaged, or what should we do? And also, I think that sometimes if people are not on video, it's a symptom of something worse. It's a symptom that maybe they think that they can work on something else while we have a retrospective. So you see that sometimes if you ask somebody and they say, oh, could you please repeat that question, that's a dead giveaway that they were actually doing something else. And I think that when you have a retrospective, as I said, it's for the team. So everybody should be focused on improving the way that the team works. So I think that thing about the body language is very difficult.
Absolutely. And many a times, I think it just becomes a part of a process instead of achieving the certain objective which is meant for.
Mm-hmm.
It just becomes a process. And I understand when you talk about all these challenges, because in last 2 years, our retrospectives happened over web, over virtual calls, and these were the very common challenges, I think, which we mostly faced.
Yeah, and I think that you have a very interesting point there, Nupur. When people say that the retrospective is something that they just have to do because of the process, I think that's very sad. And I think it's important, if people are tired of the retrospectives, to ask why. Why do we have retrospectives? Is it just because the process says so, or the Scrum Master insists, or what is it that we want to achieve? So I think that point is very important as well.
Yeah. And when we are talking about all this, I know, what are the common symptoms that we know that we are failing at it instead of just continuing it as a process?
Well, when people start becoming disengaged in the retrospectives, sometimes people don't even show up at the retrospectives. They arrive late. They say, be right back in the chat. So they have to leave for another meeting. And I think instead of trying to force people to be at the retrospective and say, you have to be there for the whole hour or 90 minutes or how long you do, instead of doing that, you should try to ask them, what do you expect to get out of the retrospective? Because if what they expect to get out of the retrospective is nothing or a waste of time, then you should probably do something about the retrospectives. It's my naive idealistic belief that every team can get something out of a retrospective, even the ones that are the most negative about it, even the ones that have the least expectations, if you make sure that you are talking about things that really are interesting to them, problems that really are interesting to them. So it could be that you have retrospectives, but there's not psychological safety to talk about the real juicy parts. So then perhaps you have to use some anonymous gathering data so that they are not afraid of saying things that are worse. Or maybe they're just discussing things that they can't really change, that other people should change. And then, of course, they become a waste of time. But also, and this is what I see very often, is that you have a good discussion, you come up with a few action points, but then nothing happens with the action points. Like they're just put somewhere in the backlog and nobody ever looks at them. And then at the next retrospective, the facilitator might ask, so what happened with the action points? And everybody's saying, we didn't really have time to do anything about that. And then of course the retrospectives are a waste of time. And then of course people don't want to engage. Then it's just something that they do, like a little ceremony or a circus. We wave our hands, we do like this, and then we've done it, right? So you have to go back to the basics and figure out what's the real problems, what's the causes behind these problems, what can we actually as a team do about it, and how can we make sure that these action points are first-class citizens, because there are a number of other tasks that we have to do in the team that are so important for the customers, for the stakeholders, for your bonus or whatever. So you have to make sure that the action points that you come out with are prioritized together with the others.
Absolutely. I know. And since we're talking about the challenges of conducting retrospective and the risk of failing at it, let's talk about how can this be made more enjoyable, more valuable to the participants as well as the organization.
Yeah, well, for it to be more valuable, it has to be the things that I talked about before. It has to be the right problems, has to be the causes, has to be the things that they can do something about. But also to make it more enjoyable, I think that to start every retrospective with somebody answering a question or showing a picture or something like that, that often makes people laugh. For instance, asking what was the last sprint like as a weather forecast, or if you would describe this team as a car, what car would it be, or what are you going to have for dinner, or what was the last thing you ate or something like that. And it seems a bit silly in the beginning, but it serves a lot of purposes. If you laugh together, then all these happiness hormones are going in your brain and in your body, and it just makes you happier, and it makes it easier for you to work with these people. So that's a good start of a retrospective. But also, if everybody has said something in the beginning, and sometimes if they don't want to show video, you can ask them, so please show me a green thing in your office, and then maybe they find post-it notes, and they have to use the video to do that. And if they share something about themselves, it makes it easier for them to relate to each other and to trust each other, to work together. And also, if they've said something, it's easier for them to say something again. And then you have to think about and this is particularly a danger, I think, if you're doing it online, that if you're doing the same retrospective every time, then the brain is sort of just answering the same things every time. If you're asking the same questions, it'll come up with the same answers every time. So I think that maybe you have to change the activities, but it could also be that you need to change the facilitator. Maybe somebody else from the team wants to get a go at facilitating, or maybe somebody from another team in the organization would like to facilitate, and then you can observe them facilitating and you can be part of a retrospective yourself. But I think what makes things enjoyable is that you have fun and that you think that you get something out of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I know. And the most challenging thing for me, which I'm very scared of when we are doing retrospectives, is the silence. Can you please highlight how you deal with silence?
Well, depends on what kind of silence you mean, because there are two types of silence. There's silence when people are thinking about things, and that's a valuable silence. So for instance, if you're asking people to gather data to put up post-it notes, then it's important to endure that silence, and it's important to enforce that silence. And when people start talking, you say, now we're just silently brainstorming about this. And I think that enduring that silence, even though it's a good silence, was difficult for me to learn how to do, because as a woman, I'm brought up with making everybody feel good all the time. So if there is silence, I fill that silence with a lot of nice words. But that's not what you should do here. It's a bit like, now I'm going a bit off topic here, but I once took a course in how do you do good salary negotiation. So salary negotiation for women is very important, I think, because normally you are negotiating your salary with a male manager, at least when I took that course 20 years ago. And they said that one thing that women has a problem with in salary negotiations is the silence. And they have to just count in their head, just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because you say some number and then the manager looks at you. And then as a woman, you're brought up with thinking, oh no, he feels bad about this. This is awkward. I should do something. And then you start saying, well, I understand why you can't pay me so much because I didn't take that course, or I didn't do this, or I didn't. And I understand that we have to save money because of blah, 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 blah. And you feel like you're talking yourself down, but you should just be silent. You should just rest with that silence. So learning to just be in that silence is something that I started learning at that point, because it helped me in salary negotiations. And then I've used that knowledge also to endure the silence in the retrospectives. Now, there's another kind of silence in retrospectives, and that's the silence when nobody wants to share anything. And that's more difficult, and that's especially in online retrospectives, that sometimes it's just completely silent. And you have to figure out what is the reasons for the silence, because there can be a lot of reasons. If they're all disengaged, then you probably maybe should just stop the retrospective and say, nobody wants this, let's try in a different way next time. But it could also be that people are silent because there's not enough psychological safety, and we're at a part in the retrospective where they need to say something which is actually some uncomfortable. And with psychological safety, you need to learn how to be comfortable in an uncomfortable situation. And if you don't have that, then maybe you have to try to gather data in a more anonymous way, or maybe you have to divide them out in smaller groups and maybe just talk 2 and 2 about this, and then add things anonymously in a doc. Of course, it would be great if we didn't need all this anonymous voting, anonymous data gathering, but solving the problem of psychological safety is not something that you just do, like in a retrospective or even within a month. It takes time. Something that I sometimes do is that if people are silent in the way that they don't even gather data, they don't put up post-it notes on the timeline, that's when I do the team radar, where I put different spokes there. I say, what's the quality of what we do? What's the communication with the rest of the department? What's the communication within the team and things like that? And then they have to just vote, like, or grade it between 0 and 5. How good do you think the quality of our software system is? And that enforces them to at least reflect on these aspects that you choose, or maybe they choose it together with you. And then you might start a discussion. They might be blank if you ask them to talk about things that are problematic, but if you make them grade different aspects of their teamwork or the system, then they can at least do that. Also, sometimes you have them gather a lot of post-it notes and then they're just quiet, and you say, what should we talk about? And they're just quiet. And I found out that in online retrospectives, doing that round robin thing where you ask people one at a time actually works. It's socially acceptable to do that online. So if I have a lot of post-it notes or a lot of topics to talk about, I just say to people, I'm going to do a round robin. I'm going to ask each of you to call out a post-it note that you'd like to talk about. It could be one that you put up yourself, could be one that somebody else put up that you don't understand or you agree with or you disagree with. And then I just ask all of them. And then everybody gets a chance to look at these post-it notes and choose one. And also, I know that when everybody have chosen what they wanted to talk about, at least everybody has had a chance to talk about what they wanted to talk about. So what I said is like two different kinds of silence. Is it just the good silence that you need to endure, or do you want to get rid of the silence when people are disengaged? I hope that answered your question.
And it brought an interesting perspective also to be in the silence, which we generally don't think of doing. We
Mm-hmm.
just want to break the silence most of the
Mm-hmm.
times. So that's an interesting perspective that we've got with this question. Thank you there. And I know I've asked a lot of questions around it, but what is the one question that you think that I should have asked you? And I look forward to the answer as well.
Well, there's a question that I get sometimes when people are asking me, I know you've written a book about it, you've facilitated retrospectives, you've talked about it, you've given like courses about it. So I guess your retrospectives are always perfect. So that's the question for me. Are your retrospectives always perfect? And the answer is no, they're not. I'm still making mistakes. I'm still actually sometimes looking in my book to find out how can I solve this, which is ridiculous. I have a very bad memory. So I have this little book where I write down for every retrospective the agenda and the names of all the people in the retrospective. And then I write down also what went wrong, what went well. So I'm still learning. I'm still making mistakes in retrospectives. I'm still allowing some discussions to go on so long that I don't have time to generate insights or to decide what to do in the right way. I sometimes send people out with small post-it notes with a very vague action point instead of something which is specific and measurable. And I sometimes let some people discuss things even if there are only two of them who are interested and everybody else is just disengaging. So I still make these mistakes because it's actually it's very difficult to facilitate a good retrospective, I think.
I understand. And I know, thank you for sharing some amazing answers out there. With that, we come to the end of our first section. And now we are moving on to the next section of this discussion, which is the rapid fire. And the first thing I would like to know is your favorite book.
Well, if it's not a book about IT, my favorite book is Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. And if it's a book about things that I work with, it's definitely the book called Fearless Change by Linda Rising and Marilyn Mans. That's definitely my favorite books.
Thank you. And what is the biggest challenge you faced in life?
That's a difficult question. I think that not having that imposter syndrome, feeling I'm never good enough, and feeling that sometimes people will just see through me and like it's the emperor's new clothes. She can't really do anything. I think that's my biggest challenge, that I don't really believe in myself.
You should. I believe we all do believe in you when we read your book.
Thank you.
Uh, and which is your favorite quote? I know which keeps you going.
Um, well, one of the things that my father used to say when he was still alive was, to understand everything is to forgive everything. And I still use that. I use that in my presentations. I used it in my book, but I also use it in my own life, because sometimes people are doing something and I'm thinking, are you evil? Are you stupid? Why are you doing this? Are you doing this just to spite me? Are you doing this to put me down? And then I try to stop myself from having this volcano of erupting feelings, and then just trying to relax and thinking, why did she say that? Why did he do that? Why did they do that? And then I can almost always find a reason, that they just wanted to feel happy, they just wanted to feel safe, they just wanted to not lose face. And I think that helps me a lot in also in regard to the things that I said before with the imposter syndrome, that maybe they're not saying this because they hate you or think you're stupid. Maybe it's actually because they've got something to deal with themselves.
Good point there. I know. Can you share one mantra for success that you follow?
Do what you want to do. Don't be afraid. Keep learning. That's what I've tried to do. Some people have asked me, so how did you make that career? What was your career plan? I never had a career plan. I I never planned when I wanted to have children, or whether I wanted to have a particular house. So I just I just normally did what I wanted when I wanted it. And I think that if you do that and you're lucky enough that you are in a position where you can do it, like I was born in Denmark, which meant that even though my parents weren't rich, I could go to university. I mean, if I had grown up in another country, I would never have gone to university because my parents couldn't have afforded it. So I've also been very, very privileged. I appreciate that. But don't think so much about it. Do what you want to do.
Absolutely. I sometimes feel that let life happen to you.
Yes.
Don't
Yes.
plan it for forever.
Yeah, exactly. Because you end up in an analysis paralysis, and you think, oh, maybe this is better than this. Maybe this is, and then you end up not doing anything. Just try it out and see. Unless it can kill you, then maybe be a bit wary of that. But otherwise, be brave. Go give that talk, write that article, go ask that question to somebody.
Thank you so much for quickly answering these questions. I know, and now with that, we come to the end of this discussion where I would like to have your expert tip on how one can become a better facilitator. I won't say perfect,
Mhm.
because there are chances to fail and there are scopes to improve. So uh, please share one quick tip around that.
Become a better listener. I think that's important. Practice to actually listen to people without thinking about your answer. Practice listening without judging. Practice listening without being too prejudiced. I know you can't take it away completely, but try to really listen to what people are saying. And then the next levels are, try to listen not so much to what they're saying, but what they mean, right? Look at the eyes, look at the face, look at the body. Try to interpret what they actually mean when they say that.
Amazing answer, I know, once again. Thank you so much. And It was an amazing discussion. A lot of insights came out of this discussion around retrospectives, how to make it better, how to deal with silence. I'm sure the audiences are going to enjoy it. Thanks once again.
Thank you, and thank you for your great questions, Nupur.